For Studio X CG Shorts, we render out the background environment separately from the foreground characters and props. This allows us to bake the GI for static objects to get a flicker-free render. However, when rendering the foreground characters, we still need to have the background environment present in the scene in order to cast GI and reflections onto the characters so they will be properly integrated into the scene. That means that for our foreground renders, we still need to load hundreds, sometimes thousands of high poly objects and high-res texture maps from the background environment, which of course slows down the render. So what we need is to bake our complex CG environment onto a simplified version of the scene geometry as HDR maps, which cast GI and reflections onto the foreground characters from the environment, integrating them perfectly into the rendered background at a fraction of the render time. This video takes you through the process of setting this up, beginning in Maya, rendering a 360 HDR in V-Ray, painting this onto our simplified scene geometry in Mari, and finally rendering the resulting UDIM maps back in V-Ray. So the first thing we need to do is take our complex geometry in our scene and create a simplified version of that geometry. Next, we will render out a 360 camera. We want to make the translation values numbers that we can remember easily later because we'll need to type them into Mari. And then we go to extra attributes, add a V-Ray camera. We then set that to spherical and set the field of view to 360 degrees. Then we'll go into the render globals. We need a lat long, so that means that we need it to be 2 by 1, so width 4000, height 2000, for example. And we're ready to render out our first 360 HDR. The first HDR is only going to give us some of what we want. There's some things that the camera won't hit, and so we need to make another camera, flip it around, so that we can see from that 360 camera the stuff that the other camera wasn't able to see, to fill in the blanks in our image. We then render out from that camera to get our second 360 HDR render, and we're ready to take both of those into Mari to paint onto our geometry. So here we are in Mari, and you can see that we have our 360 render projected onto our 3D environment. The trick here is that we need to make the projection here have the same translation values as and rotation as our render in Maya did. Also, there's like a 90-degree offset on the Y rotation of the camera. We get to this in the Layers palette under Procedural Environment Sphere Map. And you can see that there's parts of it that it's missing, where the camera wasn't able to see. So that's why we have our second HDR render, which does fill in those gaps, and we combine them together to get the best of both worlds. So what we need to do is we need to bake this down, and then once we do that, we can use a layer mask to mask out the parts that we don't want, the parts that aren't looking so great on one map, and then reveal below that the other map. You'll also notice that we have this lamp here which got projected through, which we have clone painted over to fix it. Finally, we want to save out the maps that we've created as EXR files with RLE compression. And also, I neglected to mention this earlier, but we want to make sure our channel is set to either 16 or 32-bit before we begin painting so that we get full HDR images. Alright, we're back in Maya, and you can see that we have our simplified geometry, which we've applied our UDIM HDR textures to using a V-Ray light material. We have the characters, and we also have any objects that interact with the characters or are in front of the characters. We need to render out completely to get proper mats. Last but not least, we need to turn off cast shadows on our simplified geometry so it doesn't block our lights. So here we see IPR renders of our simplified geometry, and in this particular scene the render times for the foreground renders were originally 2 hours per frame when we had everything in the scene, and then simplified geometry like this, they went down to 40 minutes per frame. So it's a dramatic increase in speed. Alright, that concludes this tutorial. Thanks so much for watching.